I am President and Distinguished Fellow at the Center for Social and Economic Progress, CSEP for short. I am delighted, absolutely delighted to welcome you all to today's flagship seminar, the 14th one that we are hosting in our first year at CSEP. Before I start, I do want to note that today is the 50th anniversary of the founding of Bangladesh. We at CSEP are reminded of this in particular, since we had a discussion just last week on revisiting India's role in the Bangladesh Liberation War, which is a new book by Ambassador Chandrasekhar Dasgupta. In the context of today's discussion, it is important to note that the very notable progress that Bangladesh has made over 50 years of its existence is really quite amazing, given that this is a country that had been popularly described as a basket case, particularly by Henry Kissinger, but now is on the verge of entering the low middle income category. Moreover, on a number of human development indices, Bangladesh now exhibits better performance than its neighbors. So this proves that nothing is impossible to do once we put our minds to it. So I thought that was a good introduction to this book, Unshackling India. So as we ourselves have entered our 75th year of independence in India, there's a great amount of stock taking place in what we've achieved and what we need to do as we go further into the future towards a centenary after independence. So we are tremendously privileged to host this discussion on Unshackling India, Hard Truths and Clear Choices for Economic Revival by Doctors Ajay, Chhibber and Salman. Ajay, if you have your book, actually I can show it. I have it right here. So this is what the book looks like, so that everyone has an image of it. The book is a very comprehensive, wide-ranging account of the economic and social issues facing India today. It is a really amazingly ambitious undertaking. I can't believe that the authors have read all the references that they have quoted, because there's so many of them. But it really covers, very ambitious, it covers a really wide canvas of issues, and issues not always addressed by economists. It has a no-holds-barred attitude towards solutions that it proposes to unshackle India in order to achieve the destiny it deserves. Among its many virtues, it packs a wealth of information, and as I said, backed by appropriate references, which will prove to be a treasure of resources for experienced scholars and students alike. Of course, one of my hobbies when I read a book is to find fault where I can't find a reference. So I've already informed Ajay on various references that are actually missing, which he puts in the text. But that's one of the things that I do habitually. So let me just introduce the two authors a little more expansively. Ajay Chhibber, long-time friend. Both of us have been co-signers at the World Bank for a long period of time. Of course, he's younger than me, so he joined later. He's currently a distinguished visiting scholar, Institute for International Economic Policy at George Washington University, and non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. I won't repeat everything he's done because otherwise there'll be no time left for the webinar. He did serve as an Assistant Secretary General in the United Nations and Assistant Administrator at the UNDP. At the World Bank, he worked extensively in leadership positions on Turkey, Vietnam, and West Africa. And to some extent, his time in Turkey and Vietnam does, in fact, find reflection in the book in terms of what he thinks should be done. Among other important things that he did, and this is more than 20 years ago, he directed the 1997 World Development Report, which was concerned with the role of the state in development. And that's, again, a theme that runs through this book. He does hold a PhD at Stanford University, MA from Delhi School of Economics, and a BA in Economics from St. Stephen's College. Salman is an economic development consultant, author, and commentator working across a range of economic development issues. Formerly with the World Bank, he now serves as a consultant to international institutions. He's a recipient of the World Bank President's Award for Excellence. In fact, I didn't know that there was such an award until I read about this. Maybe you're the only awardee for the World Bank President's Award for Excellence, which is a real distinction if that is the case. He does have an MBA from Yale University, which in my book obviously makes you highly qualified since I taught there the last 4 years. And of course, I did go to Yale and got my undergraduate degree. And he has also a BA in economics from St. Stephen's College. He's authored several books, and his commentary appears in a variety of media outlets. So let me just say why we at CSEP are hosting this. Almost all the work that CSEP is conducting now and is concerned with is policy research aimed at accelerating India's growth on a sustainable basis, which is really the theme of this book. So that we can aspire to become a high middle income status by 2050, but on an inclusive basis. Much of our work is focused on issues of climate change, the future of energy, health policy, macroeconomic, fiscal, and financial sector reforms, along with work on subnational issues. So this almost sounds like a table of contents of this book. So that's what we're doing. And so we thought it was very appropriate for us to host a discussion on this book. We also, in general, in terms of the flagship webinars that we hold, like also the one that we held last week, we are keen to feature scholarly work like this book that is methodical, well-researched, and historical, but also has contemporary policy relevance, which this clearly does. And of course, this book is mostly about the future and offers many lessons for India's future economic decision-making, but informed by extensive international experience. Now, I would expect that many of us won't agree with everything that Ajay and Salman say. If we did, it won't be very interesting. It would be quite boring if we all agreed. So there are, of course, items of controversy, which is good. I won't introduce the panel yet until I come to them. But what I'm going to do, panel of very distinguished discussants, I'll introduce them as we come along to them. What I'm going to ask the two authors is to introduce their book, taking about 5 to 7 minutes each. Perhaps you could tell us why you wrote this book, what is different in your prescriptions, and why you think members of this audience should read it. Over to you. Who wants to go first, Salman or Ajay?
I think we yield the floor to Ajay first.
Okay. Ajay, you're on mute.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
So thank you so much for that very kind introduction, Rakesh. You know, when we asked our publisher, where shall we do the launch, they immediately said, why don't you do it at CSEP? And I said, that's going to be very difficult to get CSEP to agree. Of course, I didn't reveal to them that the president of CSEP is a good friend, Rakesh Mohan, and the chairman of CSEP is also a very good friend and a college buddy of mine, Mr. Vikram Mehta. And I'm just wanted to say that I'm so impressed with the way you all have brought CSEP and made it, I would say, the premier institution on policy, social and economic policy in India. So thank you so much for hosting it. Salman and I, we have very common background. We have the same college. We went to the World Bank, but actually we didn't meet until about 2 years ago. A friend introduced us over a golf game, and we found we had many common ideas. And then came COVID, and then we said, this is a time to write a book. So this book is conceived out of COVID, if you like, because what we thought was that COVID is a time to think about where India has come from, where it's going, a rambunctious democracy, which has made progress, but as we show in the book, quite lopsided progress in many ways, and that India needs a reset and an unshackling, if you like, and I'll come to the unshackling bit. So we produced an outline, and we were very lucky that we had this wonderful editor, Swati Chopra at HarperCollins, who really encouraged us and helped us shape the ideas also very well. And that's how this book came about. Now, to answer Rakesh's question, Salman and I thought, okay, what do we know somewhat about India, and I've been now working on India ever since I went back to UNDP. and then came back to live in India. But Salman, of course, had been working in India for quite some time after he left the World Bank. What do we bring that would be different and new? And the most obvious thing to us was that we have worked on a large number of countries, middle income, developing countries around the world. And so that perspective, to bring that perspective into looking at problems in India. When I first came back to India and proposed certain solutions, the obvious answer I would always get, particularly from bureaucracy, would be, well, that may be fine in such and such place, but it's not going to work in India. India is very different. Of course, India is different. History is different. The institutional structure is different. The context is different. But nevertheless, individual human beings, Indians, react to the same set of incentives and the same set of sort of problems in very similar ways. So, and time and again, we have seen that India has delayed taking ideas from elsewhere, but eventually has come around to it, kicking and screaming, and perhaps in different ways, but certainly in that. So that's one perspective we thought we'd bring to the book. The other perspective, so it's in India, we always say, well, we're doing better than we were 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, but the world doesn't stand still, it moves on. And others may be doing 3 times better, 5 times better than what we are. And that's what we try and bring out in chapter after chapter. We try and benchmark India internationally as well. The other thing that I thought perspective we should bring is that, while we're not experts on education or health or trade or whatever, agriculture. But what is missing in India today is a framework to see how these things interact with each other. We had the 1991 crisis where you had, fortunately, Dr. Manmohan Singh was there. He had the blueprint, or the M document, as people call it, and then a team of people, 2 of whom are right here, Rakesh and Vijay Kelker, but they had an overall framework, and that framework for where India needs to go is completely missing now. You have these. So you had a framework which led to reforms, and then of course you had a Vajpayee government which did some further reforms, and all that led to considerable progress. But those reforms ran out of steam, and I think Rakesh has actually summarized it all in a book also that he's put together on those reforms some years back. And since then, we've had these sort of very piecemeal, ad hoc, one-off reforms, but nobody with a clear sense of, what is a framework around which these things come together. So we thought we'd have that perspective in this book, which is, how does the lack of education or particular way we've handled labor policies, the particular way we've looked at land policies, the way our financial system has evolved, how does all that affect the outcomes that we have had? And we have tried to bring that perspective into this book. I don't want to take up too much time, but I'll emphasize 2 things more and then turn it over to Salman. One is, of course, as you said, the role of the state, and which is partly where the title comes from, the Unshackling of India, which is that what has become very obvious is that despite the 91 reforms, which of course did some liberalization, the India still has a very highly interventionist state. And there are many things it should do more of, which is health and education and climate change. I would say even defense. India has underspent on defense hugely. But then there's a whole slew of things, as we point out in the book, where the government gets involved in. And some of this was, of course, flagged also in Mr. Kelker's excellent book, In Service of the Republic. But that's one big perspective that we try to bring about. And how does one refocus the state to do a fewer things and do them much better? and get out of other things. The other thing that we found looking at the role of the state is how centralized, and despite efforts by various finance commission to decentralize, and particularly at the local administration level, where we try and show that how a very sort of authoritarian, totalitarian state like China, more than 50% of spending is done at local level, whereas less than 5% in India. So that's another perspective we bring. The second theme I think that runs through the book is how lopsided has been the structural transformation in India, how in a way the sort of premature deindustrialization, which Danny Roderick talks about, India is an obvious case of that, to the extent that we now have more people being employed now in the employment in agriculture because people have nowhere else to go is actually increasing. So that's a second perspective I thought I would point out, Rakesh, that we try and bring, and how that Arthur Lewis type of structural transformation has become so lopsided. Two quick things I would add, that on the trade thing, we have a very good cricketing analogy, which is that just as we are turning more and more protectionist, we should remind ourselves that our cricket team used to win only at home, and now look at them, they've become world beaters, not because they shrank back into protectionism and playing at home only, but because they went out and competed and have done so well. So that's a perspective we bring on the trade chapter. And on the banking chapter, which was fun to write, where we see so many problems now, and in fact will become a big holdback for this economy as it comes out of COVID, if we don't do serious reforms in the financial sector. We have a Murder on the Orient Express analogy, where we say, whose fault is it? And we try and show that it's a collective murder that took place of crony capitalists, of very badly run banks, politicians, and might I dare say so in front of Rakesh, to some extent even the regulators. Not to pick on any one person, but generally as a system. We show that in this book as well. So let me now turn it over to Salman, with your permission, Rakesh.
Thank you, Ajay. Well, first, let me thank the Center for Social and Economic Progress and Rakesh for hosting us. It is an honor for me to be in such august company. We have Yamini Iyer, we have Vijay Kelker, we may have Nick Stern as well. And it was a privilege to write this book with Ajay. Very happy about that. I understand my wife is watching from somewhere, and so hi. And my parents are watching in India with my sister and my brother in Saudi Arabia. So hello to everyone. Now, Ajay has very nicely set the stage for me, because this book is indeed, yes, it is wide-ranging, because the economy is wide-ranging. Lots of things impact the economy. And I think we really must decisively get away from this notion that an economy is about government, infrastructure, the financial sector, and all that. We must start talking more about human development. I think we need to talk a lot more about education and health. We need to talk a lot more about social protection. And we need to talk about newer areas, the fourth industrial revolution, and so on. I think what animates me sometimes is that, we keep hearing about India as an aspirational society. We hear targets of a $5 trillion economy or a $10 trillion economy. But I want us to grapple with the reality of where we are. Yes, India has a lot of potential, but India's current realities cannot be ignored. The World Bank's WDR, the World Development Report of 2018, looks at second graders. In fact, when we were, Rakesh talked about, research for this book, I was surprised by some of the things that we saw. Second graders in India, 80% of them cannot read basic text. That puts us in the company of Malawi, worse than Uganda and Yemen. You look at health. We talk about competing with China, but we're nowhere close to China when it comes to the number of physicians that they have, or number of paramedical staff that they have. There's no comparison with the amount of money we spend on a per capita basis. So forget the US, forget Europe, we're nowhere close to China. Labor force participation rates are in the news recently, 40%, 41%. And what is driving that? Women, or the absence of women. If you look at official data, you will see that 21% female labor force participation rates. But more recent data from the Center for Monitoring of the Indian Economy suggests that it could be as close to 12%. What a huge missed opportunity. And by the way, these are country level averages. In Bihar, you're probably looking at single-digit labor force participation rates, closer to 5% in some cases. How can India progress, really? How can we get to 5 trillion or a trillion or 10 trillion? How can we get to upper middle income status if we do not address that, if we do not accept that reality? Most people are unaware. I mean, we are aware, but this book is not written for people like us. This book is written in some ways for the lay people, for lay persons. Because that's what our goal was. Our goal was not to make it an academic book, just to kind of advocate more. Labor force participation rates in India are closer to those in Iraq or Pakistan. Social protection spending, everybody knows, is fairly limited despite improvements in recent. We must acknowledge those improvements. But if we look into the future, we have to look at things like research and development. We talk about India's inequality, which has grown substantially, income inequality. There's also, we talk about this K-shaped recovery in India right now because of COVID, during COVID. There's also something K-shaped about R&D, research and development. China is going one way and India is going down. How can India progress in this modern world if that is the reality? But are we grappling with that reality? What we're suggesting here is that the answers in some ways lie in the diagnosis. Electric vehicles. I'm just taking some bits and pieces of our work and just using them to highlight what challenges we face. Between 2015 and 2019, 500,000 electric vehicles were registered in China. During that time, India registered a few hundred electric vehicles. 500,000, few hundred. We know that because of climate change, there is, natural disasters, they're rising in frequency and severity. And this pandemic tells us more about how prepared we need to be. But when India was hit with this pandemic, South Korea rolled out a national testing plan for COVID-19. India was looking for epidemiologists. 11 states in India did not have a state-level epidemiologist when the crisis hit. The National Disaster Management Authority, which is headed by the Prime Minister, does not have an executive member to lead it for the last 7 years. The Prime Minister cannot be expected to be the chief executive of India's disaster management agency. It's like saying that the US FEMA has no head for 7 years. But we don't focus on these things. We have to start thinking in terms of looking at what the future is going to look like and then combining our solutions in such a way that we deal with multiple problems simultaneously. If we could take Coal India or ONGC and help them get greener and become green energy companies, that would help us with our climate change goals, that would help us become a cleaner country. In India, I'm sure everybody knows about British Petroleum, ExxonMobil. How many people know about Iberdrola? An $80 billion green energy company. Or Next Era, $180 billion green energy company, shifting from fossil fuels to green energy. Is anyone thinking about what the next generation of Coal India is going to be, or what the next generation of ONGC is going to be, or any of these other companies? I think that's what we are trying to address in this book. Of course, you know, the solutions that we talk about, these are not just our ideas, these are ideas that many have put on the table. I mean, Yamini would be the first person to say that we need to have a more decentralized governance structure. For example, in education, we waited for the new education policy for a long time, and it has good elements, but it is a national education policy. India is a very diverse country. India cannot be run from New Delhi. But India will never decentralize if the center doesn't take the initiative to decentralize. In order for India to decentralize in various aspects, the center has to agree to get weaker. And that, I think, is going to be the big challenge for us going forward. So if we want to get to 2047 or 2050 and get to that $12,500 per capita income range, there are many things that have to happen starting now. We cannot waste time. We cannot say that we're going to, the demographic dividend window is closing. If we act, if we start working on it, maybe by 2047, maybe by 2050, maybe by 2060, things will turn around. But if we do not accept and acknowledge where we are, we will never get there. And I think that is something that is some sort of a frustration that I feel myself. But I think there are plenty of opportunities for India to do well. We just have to get on with it. And one final thought, and I leave you with this. The public discourse in India is far from these issues. We are not talking about these issues. We are talking about issues that are guaranteed to take India backwards. I think some of the majoritarian politics we see playing out in India will not just derail, any prospects that we are talking about, but may actually take us back in a way that we may not have. For example, I look at the first 10 years of this century. India was doing very well. Yes, inequality was growing, but the economy was also growing really well. I don't see any of that return to 7%, 8% growth the way things are shaping up. But what we talk about in the book is an ambition to have inclusive growth and reach that upper middle income status. And it is possible, but we need to acknowledge our reality, these hard truths, and then we have to be ready to do some of the things that we recommend in the book, and not just us, but many people. In fact, our work is the work of so many others. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Salman, for that impassioned appeal for doing some of the things that we've been neglecting, which actually goes naturally to our first panelist, that is Yamini Iyer. She is the current president and chief executive of the Center for Policy Research. She has worked in most of the areas really that Salman was talking about, including the fields of public finance, social policy, state capacity, federalism, governance, and the study of contemporary politics in India. So I think it's a very natural flow from Salman's presentation to you, Yamini. Let me just also mention that among her current, because she's done many things, so I won't again go through all her achievements, but to mention that she is a member of the State Advisory Council of Punjab, Governor of Punjab. I don't know if that still exists, Yamini, with a change in government. It probably does not. And also a member of Lancet Commission on Reimagining Health Systems in India. She has an MS in Development Science from London School of Economics, MA in Social and Political Science from Cambridge University, and yet another Stephanian, a BA in Philosophy. So, Yamini, all yours.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Rakesh, for that wonderful introduction. And thank you, Ajay and Salman, for writing this book and giving me the privilege of being an active participant, both in its writing and in its commentary. It's rare to find a book that covers every single topic that you're deeply passionate about, and then find yourself nodding through most of it, even though you're looking to see where can I shake my head and find a quibble, which is always a fun part of reading a book. But it's really so crucial that any debate on the Indian economy actually touches on the critical aspects of the real economy, parts of the economy that impact all the bulk of India, whom in so many ways live a life that is very distanced from the imagined economy and the stock market economy that we talk about, we debate about, and that often shows up in relatively better, healthier GDP numbers. And each of the critical areas that you pick up, the wicked areas that you pick up in some senses, the challenges of state capacity, the challenges of decentralization, the challenges of health, the challenges of education, the challenges of social protection, and also in many ways, the complexity of moving towards competitive markets in what are deeply entrenched and unequal contexts are tackled in this book in important and innovative ways. And it picks up, as Rakesh rightly said, a wide range of literature on these subjects, which makes for a really fantastic bibliography and reference point for all PhD students and researchers, but also, really puts together the range of perspectives, the range of data, the range of issues. And it does so in such a easy to read way that I'm actually quite envious, because I don't think that I personally will ever have the ability to write such a complex book, but in such a breezy and easy to read fashion that I can see it being picked up in airports. And it really is the airport reader that needs to read and understand the complexities of our economy so that we can reframe the debates that we have on the economy. So what I thought I'd do in my remarks, which is really focusing on issues of state capacity, social protection, health and education, push a little bit more on the issues that you lay out. And forgive me, but I'm feeling a little pessimistic these days. So some of what I say may lead us nowhere. But I do think it's important for us to ask ourselves these questions as people who have been thinking, as people who have been participants, so many of you, in the big, deep shifts that the Indian economy had now nearly 30 years ago, the place where we've ended up in today, and many of the critical questions that we are all debating. I think we need to ask whether, even as we know the core prescriptions, whether we know enough about the pathways to get there. And to me, that's really the point at which we end, I think, the real stuck is. And I think that we need to debate this a little bit more amongst ourselves and more broadly, because all the actors that we are talking about, the state, the citizens, the intermediaries are all today operating in a context that's very different, I think, and we haven't fully come to terms with this. Let me take the issue of the Indian state. And in everything that we're talking about, whether it is health, education, social protection, whether it is moving us towards a more market competitive framework, we talk about getting the state out of the way in places where it shouldn't be, and that's the starting point of your book. And we also talk about getting more of the state in places where it should be, which is the core of your thesis, particularly on these critical issues of social policy that have been long ignored. But I do think we need to ask ourselves, what is the state today? Because the state today is not the state that you were dealing with in 1991. The 1991 state was a pernicious state that needed to exit out of varied sets of places where it shouldn't have been in the first place. And in that mantra of getting the state out of the way, we didn't really build the state, even in those parts of the economy where it should have been in terms of financial markets, capital markets, regulation, for example. The NPA crisis that we see today, in my view, is partly a crisis of failing to effectively build regulatory structures for the state. But because we ignored the state, we actually today are confronting a very different animal. The state of today, the Indian state, whether you look at it at its front lines or you look at it in the elite bhavans of Delhi, even as a central vista is remaking the physical structures of the state, those who occupy the state today are very different. So we need to talk about state capacity in very different terms in the following way. I've been engaging with India's frontline state for the last 15 odd years. The most significant thing that I see different from when I started out to where I am today, I walk into a BDO's office. In the old days, you used to see the safari suit, Ray-Ban man occupying large parts of the block development office and the occasional village, the panchayat secretary who would show up. You still see the safari suited Ray-Ban's BDO, although now it's gone to jeans and long sleeve shirts. But in addition, and the bulk of what you see are data entry operators. Those are private, contracted in young boys mostly, and occasionally women, who are occupying the block development office, entering data that is fed to them, not on those fancy GPSs that we imagine sitting in Delhi, but on pieces of paper that are provided to them at the frontline office. I go to the district office and I see the DM with all the Lal Batti power, but sitting around the DM are a whole set of young DM fellows, private sector people brought in to work with the state at the district level. I go to the state secretariat and I see PwC, I see KPMG, I see a bunch of new boutique consulting firms, all participating largely in the chief minister's office with all good faith in trying to build state capacity. But there is no state. We've hollowed it out. The state today, the Indian state, is an extremely privatized entity. You and I are going to be debating whether it should be public-private partnerships for health and education, whether it should be more private sector running our airports, our roads, etc. But really, the state is run by an entirely private entity with a few IAS officers who are coming. We have a lot of business today as think tankers. A lot of our business is adding into what PwC, KPMG, Boston Consultancy Group, and these PM fellows and DM fellows are doing. We are all substituting for the core of the state. And if you look at the state cadres, they are the most ignored, run down, broken down set of actors, disenchanted with themselves, disenchanted with the role that they are playing, and frankly, with very little to do because we never really invested in them. It's a very different looking state. And what it does mean also is that it sits in deep tension with the fact that much of India still wants government jobs. So we talk about the need for restructuring. You make a good argument that perhaps the challenge for India isn't that the state is too small, but that we don't have enough state in the right places. But what we actually have is a large, vast citizenry that is desperately seeking to enter the state. The government job is still a job that they want. We have a state and an imagination of the state that is saying we actually want a more agile state, or a state that in many ways replicates the good of the private sector, so you can hire and fire, you can get more accountability. So we are bringing in contract workers into the state, but those contract workers want to regularize themselves. There's a tension between what the state is trying to do, move away from its old shackled ways, to try and do something different. But those who are entering the state still want the benefits of the old shackle for very good reasons. And so you end up with this vast majority of contract workers. I'm a participant in this, and you quote some of my work on teachers and how we push the argument that we're paying our teachers too much and we need to think about contract teachers. But you come into the system, it sits in tension, it then unionizes, it pushes for contract workers, it goes to courts. And what you actually see at the grassroots state is huge vacancies, not because we don't have enough people, but because we can't fill those jobs. So we are talking about building state capability in the context of a very privatized state, which is one that we are not acknowledging enough. We are talking about building state capability in the context of a state where the people are expecting something very different from the state to what we want the state to look like, and actually what the state itself wants itself to look like. So it sits in tension and it's not able to do its basics. And I think most importantly, we want the state to build its capacity when it has completely become disenchanted with itself. And we as a citizenry too are disenchanted with the state. When I go to do trainings with the state, in Labasna, or when in conversations with many IAS officers, I find that I am more committed to the idea as an actor outside of the state, of the Indian state's capability, if it puts its mind to it, to really deliver a world-class health and education system than any IAS officer is, including health and education secretaries. They won't admit it, but I think deep down they do feel it, which is why we keep moving in towards talking about public-private partnerships when we start debating health and education. And the point is not which is the right pathway. There may be multiple pathways. They may be getting the state out of there, may well be the right option. The challenge is when you're completely disenchanted with what the state can do, is it going to be able to do that? And the citizenry too is feeling that. We're talking about the need to build our education system. Primary school in India has been closed for 2 years. My primary school going children last walked into their school gates on the 10th of March, 2020. They went in for 2 days last week, and that was it. Where is the outrage? What is the bulk of India doing? If you look at the latest ASAR report, the bulk of India is desperately wanting to educate their children. It's not like we don't want it. It's not like we are not asking for it. So they are going to private tuition. The entire private tuition industry is flourishing in the poorest parts of India, Bihar, West Bengal, Odisha. It always had more private tuition than private schools, but now it has the poorest people sending their children there, even as most families have now enrolled into the public system. So we've sort of locked ourselves into this disenchantment. We often in forums like this puzzle about the fact that a democracy hasn't effectively demanded health and education. I wonder if democracy has actually chosen to find health and education in ways that it wants to, because it has no belief that the state is going to be able to provide it. And we are now caught in this disenchantment. So for me, the real puzzle of state capability, the real puzzle of building investments, public investments in the state when it comes to education, health, social protection, is not the technocratic prescriptions of those. Your book has more than many, and all of which are effective and perfectly sensible, even if we may want to quibble on the edges of those. It is really this challenge of breaking the disenchantment. I think your book is a very good provocation to push us to ask about this disenchantment and debate what it takes to break it. Because if we have easy to read, but really rigorous and well thought books like this out in the public domain, perhaps we can push this discourse further and push this debate further. But for me, ultimately, we will not move without breaking that disenchantment and without engaging in understanding the realities of what the state looks like today and what market looks like today. And I'm sure over the Q&A, we'll come back to that because I probably talked for long. But I do think that we also want to ask ourselves, particularly after all that we've seen with the farm laws, do we really have the right prescriptions for factor market reform in India, particularly when we're talking about land and labor, which are far more complex in more ways than one, and where in fact its relationship with the state is more complex than we would like to admit. I'll stop there.
Rakesh, you're on mute. Thank you very much, Yamini, for that very thoughtful, very insightful, and careful commentary on what Salman said in particular, but also, of course, what's in the book as a whole. Let me introduce our next distinguished panelist, person I always call Mr. Chairman. We've been friends for a very, very long time, Dr. Vijay Kelker. He's been chairman of everything, which is why I always call him Mr. Chairman. One of India's most prominent policy economists. He's done a huge number of things in terms of influencing government policy. He was advisor, among other things, to the Minister of Finance when the GST actually was first really mooted in a practical fashion. Of course, the idea had been around for some time. He was also among my predecessors, executive director of India, Bangladesh, Bhutan, and Sri Lanka on the board of the IMF. He was finance secretary earlier. He was in 2011, he was awarded the Padma Vibhushan, the second highest civilian award in the country, for his services to the country. He's also he was chairman of the 13th Finance Commission as well, among so many other things. That's why I said I call him as a chairman. He received his PhD in economics from the University of California, MS from the University of Minnesota. He survived the cold there successfully, so he's still with us. And of course, BE from the College of Engineering in Pune. Vijay, we're editing two interventions from Salman and Yamini. Can you put us in a more optimistic mode in terms of the country's future?
Rakesh, I don't know whether I can really fulfill your wish, but let me first congratulate the authors for an outstanding book. It really shows us a mirror and also provides a Lord Star and also gives a map, a guide map, how to go about it. So I think it's a wonderful book and I really enjoyed it. I learned a lot. I particularly liked, I mean, each chapter is good, but I found that the chapter of women is probably, I sort of found it extremely important. So usually it's not adequately emphasized. I will start from somewhat different end if Ajay and Salman permit me. And this is because what I learned from my mentor, Professor Sukuman Chakravarti, he says, Vijay, when you think about development policy, I think it's useful to identify what are the binding constraints on the system. Because there are a number of constraints, but if the binding constraint doesn't move, moving anything else becomes really not as important as or rewarding as it should be. So it's important, I think, identify the binding constraints. And amongst all the constraints they have mentioned, to my mind, and I'm really going the same vein what Yamini was talking about. I do believe the binding constraint is the governance and the state capacity, and in a very, very in multiple dimensions it has. So I'm going to talk about this in what I would argue that the way forward, because it's important to achieve the sort of lodestar which provide the aims and objectives. I have no problem with objectives, but I do believe that we'll think about how to go about it. And I think the starting point may have to be the governance and state capacity. Now, I think, to my mind, the way as I understand the governance structure of India today as it developed, it is four major pillars. The four parliament, judiciary, and the government, and now in recent times, the regulatory regime. And there are four pillars, I think, where we have to now strengthen. And I hope that the Salman's presence as a co-author, they may have much better thought than I would have. But I think I'm now, as I grow older, and I see all the pillars, I'm persuaded that Parliament is the most important pillar where to strengthen, because that's where I think I have a highest hope that is institution which probably for far more important and more important So I would argue that the parliament has to be given a much larger role in our governance. And one would, I mean, to give an example, I think the parliamentary committees is an extremely underutilized instrument in our governance, and it's a very rich instrument. And if you can think about it, and I hope that some point of time, Salman and Ajay can talk about it or write about it, because to my mind, that could be a very important starting point in terms of improving the governance and state capacity, because Parliament, I think, is critical in this whole thing. And I'm talking the way I saw it in my own working in Delhi. There have been many snafus were avoided because of that time alert parliamentary committees. Unfortunately, it has eroded over time. But parliamentary committee always improved the bills. The debate always enriched the bills. So I do believe that parliament has to be strengthened. The second is the pillar which has required is a really judiciary system. And I'm going to invite, by making remarks, invite contempt of the court kind of argument. But there are very interesting, simple measures to unclog our judicial system by reforms. For instance, today the government or state is the largest litigants in our system. And when Moiliji was a law minister, he made extremely important proposal. Unfortunately, didn't get traction while he was the minister. Of course, was neglected since then. Is to have what we call national litigation policy, which would have taken away the burden on our judicial system and would have really made the judicial system perform its role with much greater efficiency and productivity. And of course, I think one should look at many other things, I think, but I would want to focus on this as an example by which we can strengthen the governance by strengthening the judicial reforms. Again, administrative reforms is really, again, I don't know how many of you seen Moily Saab's report on administrative. It was second or third commission administrative reforms. I think it is a very rich proposals from increasing capacity at different levels of the government, and well, I think that's where perhaps a lot of possibility lies in improving productivity system. And finally, I think the new latecomer in this, our Trimurti have now become fourth member, which is regulatory regimes, regulatory structure. I'm afraid today it has been captured by the administrators. It has become administrative state. It is becoming in many cases the rogue regulators, because there's no. I think one of the important parliamentary reform would be there has to be parliamentary oversight of regulators. I think because the government uses or administration uses regulators to do things through their ankush of appointments and extension. I think parliamentary oversight of our regulatory regime would go a long way in improving the governance, in my view. So this is the sort of first state of the other state of I have a Rakesh will have to forgive me because I'm still a one-idea man, and I do believe that today the binding constraints in administration is that we are making our administration far too complicated. We have to simplify rules, simplify policies, and simplification of policies. And just to give an example, GST is a classic example. How good policy by making complicated, you lost the game. So it's just 3-point program: simplify, simplify, simplify. And I don't want to sort of read out what I think about it, but I think there's an enormous lesson there of where things are going wrong. Is we are making system complicated, and I think complex systems are becoming again increase the problems of governance and state capacity just on matching with complexity. Other point I want to make is just follow up with what Yamini said, is the importance of decentralization. And as a process of improving the state capacity and of delivering the goods and services at the local level, and for that you have to change the financial empowerment of the three levels. And I mean, my favorite hobby horse is that GST is an excellent instrument for giving resources to the third tier, because it will increase both demand and supply for better governance, and you'll find enormous change in terms of state of governance and state of state capacity. So as I said, I would argue that to the binding constraint, if you once you remove the binding constraint, you'll get much larger returns on all other proposals they have made in this outstanding book. But this outstanding book of different proposals will not yield the results unless we remove the binding constraints. And I will stop at that. And this is what I thought I meant.
Thank you.
This book will create debate and discussion and find for all of us a way forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Vijay. To just take your last point, book to ignite debate and discussion, I think we have to get Ajay, Chhibber, and Salman to move to India. They can't do all this. Sitting happily in the confines of Washington, D.C. and the UAE. I mean, this just doesn't work. If you really want to unshackle India, unshackle yourselves from your comfort zones in the United States and UAE. Otherwise, you're not going to ignite debate out here. What is to some extent frightening is the amount of consensus between the authors and Yamini and Vijay so far. Nick, let me first introduce Lord Nicholas Stern, very old friend, I think maybe almost 50 years, maybe coming to 50 years. It's really very kind of you to agree to do this at a very short notice. And I know that you have a very busy schedule, lecturing and everything else. I think you just finished a lecture and joined us. So thank you very much indeed. We really appreciate your support to CSEP. Now let me introduce you, even though I guess everyone knows you, but I still like to introduce you. It's a real pleasure to introduce you. So the full title now is Lord Nick Stern of Brentford. He's probably the most honored economist in the United Kingdom, if not in the world. He's a companion of honor, there is a CH. He's a fellow of the Royal Society, and of course, he's a lord. Among other things, he's also IG Patel Professor of Economics and Government at LSE. And I can claim some hand in that I did, as Deputy Governor, manage to convince the Reserve Bank and the State Bank of India to endow that chair. So therefore, he owes me for his position. He has a long career. I won't go into all of it because it'll take too much time. He was the chief economist of the EBRD. He was chief economist and senior vice president of the World Bank. He received his PhD in economics at Nuffield College in Oxford, a BA in mathematics at Peterhouse in Cambridge. But most important for us actually is that he has a very long association with India from his youth, from his misguided youth when he spent a year in Palanpur in a village, and he keeps on going back. He never learns, he keeps on going back. So he has a real sort of ground level understanding of development in India, how India has changed. And finally, he's among the early economists who really talked about climate change. And he is currently the president of the Grantham Institute on Climate Change. So Nick, thank you so much for joining. Now, one thing, again, the same question I asked Vijay, as you know, we Indians are argumentative and we are constantly really very impatient with what we do. I hope you can throw some light on how we can actually become better in the future.
Thank you so much, Rakesh. It is almost 50 years. I came to India first in 1974. Yeah. And the two people who were most instrumental in bringing me were T.N. Srinivasan and Manmohan. Sadly, of course, we've lost T.N., but I've been coming back, and living in India ever since. And the last intercontinental plane I took was coming home from India in February of last year, and my first intercontinental plane will be back to India. I'm hoping in February, but we live in a world which is full of uncertainties. But thank you so much, Rakesh, for all the friendship, and indeed for your role in the IG Patel chair. But it's so good to see so many other friends on this platform, and thank you. Now, I agree with the others. It's a really fine book. It's clear, and it's got a strong overall message. I think I would certainly, as with others, embrace the idea of the centrality of entrepreneurship and investment in the whole process of growth, of the importance of investing in human capital, and of the role of the state, and indeed the capacity of the state, as Yamini and Vijay emphasized, in that whole process of generating the conditions under which entrepreneurship, investment flourish, and investing in human capital so that people have the capacity to drive this whole story. Now, it's not the tradition of the London School of Economics to dwell on agreement. So let me, having embraced the central ideas in the book strongly and with enthusiasm, let me point to, in the language of Sherlock Holmes, let me point to the dogs that did not bark, or did not bark loudly enough, in my view. To be fair, these dogs barked a little bit, but I would have had them barking much louder. The first of these, I'll give you four, and I'll try and do it quickly. The first is the most important, really, the chapeau, is that we are now in India, and I hope you'll allow me to use we along with you all. We are now in India at a moment of enormous potential for creating a new growth story. A growth story which is sustainable, resilient, and inclusive. A new model of growth, which gives you cities where you can move and breathe. It gives you ecosystems which are robust and fruitful, and creates enormous investment opportunities. Prime Minister Modi set out something really in the spirit of this at his very important speech in Glasgow at COP26 at the climate conference. And I think it was a major signal that this story is now being led from the top, but actually it's been coming in many ways across India. If you look at the way in which renewable power has been out competing fossil fuel-based power, if you look at the leadership of Dalmia Cement in driving towards low-carbon cement, if you look at Reliance declaring for net zero by 2035, or Mahindra or Tatas, the big Indian groups now have declared for net zero. And I think that encouraged Prime Minister Modi in setting out the kind of model that he set out. Now, because it brings so many benefits, does not mean that it's easy. It means a lot of investment, innovation, dislocation, management of complex systems, the cities, the energy systems, the transport, and the land. But the returns to getting this right are tremendous. And that's something which goes beyond simply the idea of unshackling to liberate the investment. It does need that, of course it does. But this is now investment for a purpose. It's investment in a particular direction. And it's an investment with great, great urgency, because otherwise it will be too late for the world as a whole. And of course, India is a major player and a major part of the world economy, as the book emphasizes on a number of occasions, rightly and strongly. So tremendous opportunities, but there's a great urgency, and it does mean investment, and most of that investment will be private sector, but a big part of it will also be public sector, particularly around the infrastructure, where typically the private public balance is a bit different from elsewhere. But this will be then a story of a new kind of investment. It's not just unshackling for investment and let investment go where it may. It's actually investment with strong orientation in certain directions, particularly around the infrastructure. But India has great advantages here. 80% of India's infrastructure that will be there in 2050 is yet to be built. There's an enormous opportunity to leapfrog and do things in much cleaner and more attractive ways than in the past. The business sector, as I've already said, is already moving. India's skills in digital management around its major IT and management firms, I think, will be a very big part of that story as well. Now, I don't want to go on too long on that, but that is now a new growth story which is being embraced across India, and it is not simply just any old investment. It's investment with a purpose across the whole economy, and there are tremendous opportunities in every sector that you look. The second thing I would point to, a dog that could have barked a bit louder, is natural capital. India's natural capital is of tremendous potential in terms of the way in which it can be used so much better to manage India's resources. It's natural infrastructure. I mean, so much of the way in which we manage our land and our forests affects the way in which the whole water system works in India. It's infrastructure in the sense of, we should use the term of infrastructure in enabling other activities. It's natural capital, which will be very important for the negative emissions we need, but also the resilience we need. I mean, let me just give a couple of obvious examples. The mangroves are very good for resisting storm surge for barriers. They're very good for fish. And if you like your tigers, as I do, along with my friend Bitu Sagal, they're good for the tigers and the tourism as well. And actually, they're very good at capturing carbon. So it's mitigation, adaptation, and it's development. Restoring degraded land, mitigation, adaptation, development. Public transport, mitigation, adaptation, development. A system of route intensification for rice. Again, it's, you don't flood the paddy fields, so you don't release the methane. You save on energy around water, and you're more resilient against difficult weather. So many examples, a lot of the building story again. So much of what we would do, and I stressed examples beyond natural capital, but so much of what we can do does involve natural capital and using it much better than in the past. Restoring degraded land would be a big part of that story. I mean, if you look around the world, we probably spend about $700 billion a year or more on agricultural subsidies. And what do we get? Degraded land, poisoned rivers, and cut down forests. That's true right across the world, and to some extent true in India as well. And that is something where we could really change for enormous benefit. So that's the second dog, natural capital. The third is public finances. And like so many of you on this call, I've been working away on Indian public finances, in my case for 40 years, when I started working on value-added taxation with Raja Chalaya, Amaresh Bagchi, KB Lal, and so on back in the day. It took a little while to get through, maybe 30 years or more, but it got through. And I do think that if we're talking about investing in human capital, some parts of the infrastructure here, the public finances are critical. And any part of unshackling and unleashing will involve stronger public finances, particularly around investment in human capital, but of course beyond that. And the great advantage of value-added taxation, or GST, is not simply the resources it raises itself, but what it tells you about the income tax, and what it can greatly enhance the capacity of the public finances elsewhere. Again, we could have a whole session on public finances. Let me just note it. Finally, and fourth dog that I think might have barked louder is the informal sector. There actually are very good 3 or 4 pages on the informal sector, around 277 pages, if you have the book in hand. And I agree very strongly with what is said there. But actually, I think it's so important that much more could have been said around the informal sector. That's where so much of the action takes place. And that Rakesh kindly introduced Palanpur, but let me illustrate. Our latest book is called How Lives Change. And in many ways, how lives have changed in Palanpur is, of course, investing in agriculture, which they have done, but also in movement out of agriculture. And let me emphasize that this is not a particularly entrepreneurial, dynamic village. You know, it's a fairly backward village in a fairly backward state, Muradabad district in UP. But the way in which lives have changed have been driven by opportunities, of course, in agriculture, but also and particularly in the informal sector. Looking after, mending motorcycles, opening shops, moving sacks in the rail yard in Muradabad, marble polishing, all these things which are largely service sector activities, making bricks, another part. So these kinds of informal activities have been absolutely critical to raising living standards. So those three important pages quite rightly say we must make sure those opportunities in the informal sector are enhanced, that they're not shackled, to use the language of the book, by excessive regulation or formalization too quickly. But how you actually do that, how you liberate and give still more scope to the informal sector, whilst over time, drawing it more closely into the net of taxation and standards and so on, seems to me to be a critically important challenge in this whole story of unshackling. You want some formality, but of what kind, when, and this is just of huge importance in the economy as a whole. But let me finish as I began. It's really a tremendous book. Ajay talked about the accessibility to his father. Ajay, that was a test I used to use as well. I often failed it, but you have not failed it on this one. So congratulations, Ajay and Salman. Congratulations to you both.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Nick, for your comments and taking us a little further into the future, and especially all the things that we need to do to have a sustainable economy, and something on which, of course, Ajay has worked on for a long time. Before I'm going to restrain myself from my own comments because time is short. We have a few questions from the audience. Let me start with one from Rahana Sinha. I said the book talks about the decreasing labor force participation of women, proposing 7 to 8 measures to mend the situation. Some of these really require a shift in social attitudes along with policy measures. How much does this aspect as low labor force participant women really matter for the economy? I think this is extremely important because we do have among the lowest labor force participation rates of women, and it has come down even further in recent years, which is a real puzzle. I don't know whether I should ask the authors, Ajay and Salman, to respond, or maybe Yamini would like to respond first.
I can come after them.
Okay. Ajay, Salman, who wants to take this up?
Yeah, just that one, I'll just, on the labor force participation rate, I mean, maybe Salman will talk more, but I should point out one thing, and we put that number in the book. If you calculate the kind of, the way the labor force participation rate is calculated is paid work, right? But if you calculate the unpaid work as well, the labor force participation rate of Indian women goes to 87%. That means that women are still working. They're just not getting paid. Misconception that people have that, well, if the labor force participation rate is 20%, it means they're just sitting idle at home. That's not true. Women are actually working back-breaking work. They're just not getting paid. I think that's an important dimension. And the contrast with Bangladesh, where there has been such a sharp increase, is quite striking, that when there were opportunities for these women to come out, and okay, there might not be great working conditions in all those textile factories in, and you remember the Rana Plaza fire in Dhaka, and, there were awful conditions, but nevertheless, the young women in Bangladesh feel they are better off coming to these places to work than, doing unpaid work on the farm, which is what a lot of the situation in India ends up being. Yeah. So that's one thing I wanted to say, but let me turn
to... cut it short because Yamini has to leave. I just want to just say that I don't think anyone says women are sitting around doing nothing. I mean, the point is that women do housework everywhere in the world. The question is, why is India's paid labor force participation so much lower? Yamini.
No, I think that's precisely the challenge, because it is both a social challenge and it is also a challenge of how the market operates. And it's one that's only getting sharper in two ways. I think the latest, the PLFS numbers that were just released, which were released after the book, tell us that, in fact, labor force participation rates of women are looking somewhat better because women are now going into even worse kinds of low-paid jobs. And with the pandemic, even forms of employment like Narega that were largely where female employment was significant have now sort of men are substituting and taking over. And one of the challenges that the Indian economy has faced in the last 5-7 years, the combination of the shocks of demonetization and COVID have put women's work in an even more precarious situation, because women are the first to lose jobs and the last to gain jobs when the economy contracts and tightens. So what we have right now is a perfect storm of a contracting economy, which inevitably prioritizes male work while relegating women to the least productive forms of the parts of the economy. And at the same time, a larger social context in which women's work is sort of confined with or intersects with social norms. And we don't have good enough policy thinking on how to bridge the two. So here are some things that we know on this. We know, for instance, that transport is a huge issue. For women. Women require safety. Women require a context of working which is as close to their homes as possible. But look where our policy invests. We invest in bullet trains. We invest in big highways. We had the Pradhan Mantri Gram Sadak Yojana, which was a good starting point. But there's a lot of work that takes place between villages and movement that takes place for work between villages and small towns, or rural villages and rural villages, which are now census towns where women can find work. We do nothing to improve the transportation system that would allow more mobility and more flow. So it's also a question of policy prioritization. When women's work or when gender issues are brought up in the policy space, we talk about gender budgeting, which I find distracts from the most critical issue, which is, if you actually want to improve women's labor force participation, what are ways in which you can create working conditions that enable women to participate in the workforce? There's one more question here, which I do want to beg your indulgence just to say one thing on, and I meant to say it in my opening remarks, but didn't get the opportunity. Abhay Pethe asks about the political economy. And I did want both Ajay and Salman for you to reflect for us on this issue. So, when there's a lot of discussion around the social protection piece of your chapter of your book around universal basic income, cash transfers versus in-kind transfers. But again, one of the things that is really puzzling me, if you actually look at what's happening at the states as well as at the Government of India level, we have in fact graduated into a welfare state that is entirely direct benefit transfer, and it's essentially about cash transfers. It's not universal because it's affective, it's emotive. So women, certain SC, ST, certain categories of voters are receiving direct cash transfers. By one estimation, the state of Andhra Pradesh, which has 50,000 crores of cash transfers, the average house is getting about 2 lakhs of cash transfers. So, and it's all linked to a political economy that has presidentialized. It's presidentialized at the state level. It's presidentialized at the national level. So here's the puzzle. Does a more presidentialized politics incentivize more cash transfer based welfare economy, a welfare state? rather than a welfare state that genuinely invests in core public goods. We've always had this problem. In the 2000s, we started talking about rights that I personally think gave a little bit more space to talk about public goods, even though we didn't invest in those public goods. But now the combination of technology and presidential political economy, where attribution for welfare is crucial to the nature of politics, shall we, given the nature of our political economy, kiss investments in public goods goodbye? Just a question for you all.
Actually, thank you very much, Yamini. And in case you have to log off because of your other engagements, thank you very much for all your remarks. And once again, gracing an occasion with CSEP. But that leads me into a question from Nitin Desai, who's one of your endorsers of the book, Ajay and Salman. It's actually just what Yamini was saying. A real problem is the deterioration in our politics to a point where the principal preoccupation of all political parties is quick handouts. Is there any political party or prominent political leader who will buy into required reform agenda? Now, I would just expand that question in saying that, look, yes, this has been going on for a long time. Handouts have become pretty standard activity, whether it's in Tamil Nadu, whether it's in UP, whether it's at the national level, etc. But at the same time, over 30 years, I'm taking a long period since 1991, we have done many systemic reforms, some well, some not so well. So there's a real question here. Is it the case now that this handout kind of what might call welfare state incentive system in the political economy much worse than what it has been the last 30 years?
Question for us?
Yeah, because I mean that's a question from Nitin, and I'm expanding on that. And the point being that even though, as you have pointed out, Nick has pointed out, GST has many flaws, but we have done a GST. I mean, Nick started working on that on a VAT, as he said, in the mid-70s. It takes a long time for these things to happen, but we have had large systemic reforms in almost every area. So I'm just saying that, look, is it the case that the atmosphere today, political atmosphere, whether it's central level or state level, is it worse than it has been before?
So I'll just say two quick things, but I'll let Salman speak because he has not had a chance to respond. But on my side, I mean, I think we are very clear in the book that India has become a welfare state before becoming a developed state, but it does welfare itself also very badly because of that problem of state capacity. It relies on an antiquated sort of handout system that there is just then so much leakage in that.
No. So, that is well put out in the. Sorry if I interrupt. That's well put out in the book. The question is, look, this has always been there. Yet lots of things have been done. Not very well. Some not very well. Question: is the time for systemic reform more difficult than before, given all these things that exist, which we all know?
Yes, I think. Well, I don't know if it's more difficult, but you would think that, you know, when you have, and Nick pointed out the role of public finances, when you have a situation in which now you have, you know, the debt level being whatever it is, you have such a tight fiscal situation, I think it's time to think through how can I deliver that welfare much better in a much more modern way in what most other countries do. But I mean, you just can't have cash handouts being put on top of everything else that there is in the system. You look at what's happening now in a lot of the way this thing is done, is that every other subsidy system that we have remains where it is. And then on top of that, you have put this add-on of a PM Kisan scheme, etc. No, so this is not the way to do this reform. But to your point about you know, whether this will happen or not, I mean, if there is a time for a reset, that time is now, given the way where we are, and that much of it should not be decided at the central government level, but you should allow these things to get much more decided now, whether it is land, labor, all these policies that we talked about, and Yamini has of course left. But I think what we are trying to say is it's too big a country to have this kind of second, third generation reforms all being decided in the parliament without even proper parliamentary committees being met, as Kelker was saying. So I think that's where the book is pushing. But Salman hasn't spoken, so let me stop here.
Thank you, Ajay. I think just on this,
very briefly, Salman. Yeah.
Yes, just on this. Obviously, the political economy now is such that it makes it much harder to do welfare the right way. I think the handouts business is here to stay for now, and I think Yamini makes it clear why. Because we have much more presidential form of politics, both at the national level and at the level of states. However, welfare also means good education, public school education, good hospitals and dispensaries and stuff like that. And I think there is space in India. And, this book is not about politics, but I have been in politics. I am in politics to some extent. I've worked on the ground, and you can actually have a conversation with people about how lack of good government schools and lack of good government hospitals is a tax on poor people. And people get it. They get it. I think it is only a matter of time before some politicians come up and say, what you need are good schools, good healthcare, and decent jobs, because that is what you ultimately are looking for. This is just a way of short-circuiting what you truly deserve. And I think it will fire up the imagination of people when people speak that language. I think people are very bright. They understand what is in their self-interest. They understand when somebody gives them a little bit of a handout, they know that this is not a job. They know this is not enough for their children's education in a private school. I was shocked, when I went to rural areas of Kashmir and found in villages, people abandoning government schools and going to private schools. So even for 200 rupees or 300 rupees a month, that is a lot of money for poor people. And that is a tax.
That's very well brought out in the book. Nick, if I can just move to you.
I think just to try to respond to your question, Rakesh, which is a very fair one. I think there are some pluses at the moment now that should continue, and that's around Aadhaar and mobile phones. And now the accessibility, as it were, of people to what's happening, and the two-way accessibility to people in the state is so much more powerful. I mean, I shouldn't overdo Palanpur, but so many of them now have smartphones, and they're not rich. I mean, they're right. I say it's a poor village in a poor state, and of course, Aadhaar is quite a phenomenal happening in the world. And so those technological advances, I do think, mean that some kinds of reform are possible that would not have been possible before. How they could be used to advantage, of course, is something one has to look at very carefully. The second is the subsidy economy has been really troublesome to the Indian public finances, and actually troublesome to outcomes as well, particularly in agriculture. And I suspect there's quite a bit of scope there. And lastly, to agree strongly with Salman, if you look at the way redistribution occurs around the world, a bigger part of it is on the expenditure side of the budget than on the tax side of the budget, particularly via the investments in human capital. So that, I think, would be a big part of the reorientation, to try to take away and look into, and it's ages since I looked at the numbers, but try to look into the subsidy side of the economy and ask how that could be shifted over to the human capital, that side of the expenditure, alongside reform of property tax and income tax, in part piggybacking on some of the information you're going to get from the GST.
Yeah. Just one question for you, Nick, that particularly with the issue of climate change and everything associated with it, in the sense of really a complete reordering of how we generate energy, how we transmit it, how we consume it, how we regulate it, etc. and all the commitments made by the Prime Minister in Glasgow. The question is that those are, I mean, those we know what he said, what we need to do. The question is, does it have to be, and this is the context of what we've been talking about, how can that be decentralized, or that has to be centrally driven?
Some parts of the policy would be central, but most of the action would be decentralized. But you can have, and India has moved in this direction, national regulation about the sale of internal combustion engine vehicles. And India, I was at, excuse me, I was at a CII seminar earlier this week when on transportation, a gentleman from Hero emphasized how important two-wheelers and three-wheelers were in India, and how actually those are vehicles where you can electrify to everybody's benefit pretty quickly. So I do think that, whilst you might have some central regulation and standards in this particular area, the response would be in the markets. A second area, of course, is the electricity industry itself. And India probably has to multiply its electrical capacity by 4 or 5 between now and mid-century. You've got the big deficits at the moment, but you've got the electrification of transport as well, rise in air conditioning, which is going to be a very important part of the story. So the expansion of the electricity power sector in India in this next 30 years will be enormously important. And that has to be a combination of central and states. It's usually at this point in the discussion that I apologize profusely for the 1935 Government of India Act, which allocated things, in a rather rigid way, things to the states and things to the center, including around electric power. But I think you're working to overcome that. But the institutional reform in the electric power sector will involve closely the states, the center, and the private supply, including, of course, all the way down to decentralized solar. So that's a classic example which will be decentralized right to the bottom, through the institutional structure in states, through the private sector supply, up to the kind of standards and regulations you set, and of course the supply of low-cost finance, in which the centre will have a role. So the answer to your question, Rakesh, it depends where you look, but it is going to involve all the way right from the bottom to the top, and some coherence in that. And that's why I emphasize that there's this great new growth story in our hands, but it isn't easy. But we can see the kinds of things that we need to do, and they ought to be greatly to the benefit of most people in India.
Vijay, I wonder if you would like to comment on any of the issues we just talked about in the discussion, even though your camera is off.
Oh, can you hear me?
Yeah.
No, I was really intrigued and got interested in a comment made by Salman about how the new politics may move around, right? I can see at state level and local level, there will be politicians demanding, so there could be a sort of vote catching phenomenon. I think he's absolutely right. That this is how the change is going to come. It's going to come from political demand. And at the time is absolutely right for this to happen, in my view.
Thank you, Vijay. So I think that we have about 8 minutes over time. So I regret very much that we have to conclude, because I think this is a discussion that can go on very long. I won't try to summarize, but I can only say something about my hobby horses. One, that we did not talk anything at all about manufacturing and trade, even though it's there in the book, but it is also a very small dog that is barking very softly in the book. Because a lot of the issues about subsidies, etc., are something that we discussed, are because people don't have jobs. particularly the rural areas. And so you're buying them up by giving them subsidies. And therefore, a real issue for the country is to generate non-agricultural jobs, which we have just not been doing. And a lot of that has to do with manufacturing and trade. My second hobby horse, that of course, the book emphasizes very strongly, and I'm delighted, is of course to do with education and health, which we neglected for 75 years. The only kind of silver lining on that is the huge increase actually in numbers in education at every level. Quality, yes, is a problem that again was pointed out in terms of us surveys, etc. But at the same time, as again Salman was saying, that people are willing, poor people are willing to pay 200 rupees a month, etc. for children to, it shows that people want it. And the failure is public policy failure in not providing it and making people poorer in a sense by having to pay for these public services. Third, decentralization, again, my hobby horse. My first published paper was indeed on urban property tax in India back in 1974. And I think that's when I first met Nick, when he was here and I was here rummaging around property tax. It's a hugely underused resource. And given the rate of urbanization, given the rate of formal housing from formal finance, I just don't understand why we don't do urban property tax as much as we should, because it's not simple actually in terms of actual implementation. Fourth, not much mention of investment in agricultural R&D rather than subsidies to farmers. Again, my second published paper was indeed on the productivity of agricultural R&D. It was back in 1975. So these are some of my hobby horses. And final hobby horse, which covers everything, which Nick mentioned actually, is public finance. And our tax GDP ratio has been solidly stagnant for 12 years, which doesn't make any sense whatsoever, given that, even if 6% average growth rate in real GDP, 11% or something in nominal GDP, it makes no sense for the tax GDP ratio to be rock solid for the last 12 years. There's clearly huge problems of compliance, and many of the things that we talk about in terms of strengthening the government, public policy, etc., you can't do it unless you increase the tax GDP ratio. So I'll shut up on that, but I have to do a personal advertisement. Those of you who don't have enough time to read 400 pages, read a thin paper on third generation reforms. You'll find on the CSEP website, third generation strategy for accelerated growth and development in India, need for government strengthening institutional development. It has all the points that they have in the book, but it's only 30 pages, so it's much easier to read. I wrote the summary before I read the book, actually. So thank you very much, both first Salman and Ajay, for giving us this opportunity. In some sense, because I was presenting this webinar, I had to read the book, and that was a real pleasure. I learned a great deal from it. Thank you very much, Vijay, for agreeing to be your usual wise self, and your single point on simplification is very welcome. And as you know, that's what we were trying to work together when we were around the industry ministry in the 1990s. And Nick, of course, is really kind of you to find the time to join us. And I hope that you will keep supporting us in this fashion. Thank you very much. And thank you everyone, of course, in the audience.
Thank you.
Thank you.